Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is the show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Takeshi Tornier, AIA, Architect and Director of Snøhetta's New York studio. Snøhetta has offices all over the world. Was going to list them, too many. Offices all over the world. Takeshi is a licensed architect and director at Snøhetta's New York studio with 20 plus years of experience. Since joining the firm in 2009, he has led diverse projects across cultural, institutional, residential, and master planning scales. His recent work includes leading the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra renovation and expansion, which opened in the fall of 2025, and the Soundview Recreation Center in New York City. Takeshi also led the Isabel Bader Center for the Performing Arts. Prior to Snøhetta, he worked with Shop Architects in New York and Tadao Ando in Japan. The project we are talking about today, if you haven't guessed it already, is the recently opened St. Louis Symphony Orchestra's Powell Hall in St. Louis, Missouri. Snøhetta's design for the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra's Powell Hall expansion reinterprets a century-old landmark through an architectural language of continuity and contrast. A series of canted masonry shells define the addition, their inclined planes and arched apertures referencing the rhythm and proportion of the existing structure without direct imitation. Now, let's get into the details. My guest today is Takeshi Tornier, AIA, Architect and Director of Snøhetta's New York studio. Snøhetta, usually I read the offices, but Snøhetta has so many all over the world that I'm just going to tell you, Snøhetta has offices all over the world. Quick little fun fact, Craig Dykers, one of the founders of Snøhetta, was our keynote speaker here in Portland, Oregon at our Portland CSI Industry Forum back in 2014. And Snøhetta has done some work here in my hometown, including the James Beard Public Market and the Willamette Falls Riverwalk, neither of which we are talking about today. Today, we are going to talk about the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra project in St. Louis, Missouri. Takeshi, welcome to Detailed. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on this podcast. And I have to admit, this is actually my first participation in a podcast. So,
well, I'm sure
bear
it's
with
going to
me.
be just fine. I have no doubts already since we chatted before we got started. I like to start with an icebreaker question just to get a little warmed up and get to know you a little bit. And so and I change it for every guest, so you never know what you're going to get. My question for you today is, what would you say is the most memorable project to date that you have ever worked on in your career? Tell me about that.
Well, of course, I have to say it has to be the project that we're talking about today, the expansion and renewal for the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. A very special project in my career, and it's one of those projects that just don't come along very often. It's one of those that has a lot of cultural significance and a real potential to bring people together through music, not only the music, but also the building, the architecture. So,
well, good. I'm glad I asked that question since that's the project we're talking about today. Let's talk about the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra project. Let's start with some background. Who's the client and what were they, when they first approached you or first put out their RFP or however they did that, what were they looking to achieve?
So the client is the symphony in St. Louis. Maybe quick background for those who are not familiar with the institution. It is actually a very old symphony. It's the second oldest in the country. They are around since 1880, and it's the second after the New York Philharmonic. The symphony, when they started in 1880, they were in a different venue, and since then they moved to various venues within St. Louis until 1968, when they moved into their current home which is called Powell Hall, the building. It's a historic building that started its life as a vaudeville movie palace. So it was not a purpose-built concert hall. It was a movie palace, built in 1925, so exactly 100 years ago. And it was designed by Chicago theater architects, Rapp and Rapp. And that firm, Rapp and Rapp, designed many theaters all across the country. We have several still here in New York. The King's Theater in Brooklyn is very famous. It was also renovated recently. So that became their home in 1968. They moved in. That was sort of the first transformation of that building. The acoustics were already fairly good, and they were further improved at that time. They made adjustments to the seats. There were way more seats before when it was a movie theater, and they reduced it to about 2,600 seats at the time. And then fast forward, the symphony has used that venue, since '68, without a lot of changes. And they really came to the point where they had to go through another large, major transformation to really change the building or make it really fit for the future, for a modern symphony, for all their needs. And that's kind of where we came in. Even before having the interviews, this was an interview process. We competed with 2 other firms at the end, were invited for this interview. But the symphony already had ideas, what they wanted and needed, and they engaged 2 other firms even before the architects. So they worked with theater planners, and they worked with an acoustician. It was Schuler Schuck from Chicago. They're the theater planners, and then Kierkegaard, the acoustician. Brian Corey, he's local. He's from St. Louis. He already spent years kind of, trying to understand what needs to happen to the hall to, even improve the already good acoustics further. And then the same for the theater planners. They work with the symphony on all their needs, especially for the backstage areas. And when you look at the building, it was a movie palace. So it never really had a backstage area. There were no dressing rooms there. There were no practice rooms. So the symphony for decades made use with every space they could find in the building. There's anecdotes about musicians playing in the basement, practicing in boiler rooms, changing either at home or quickly in a restroom even. So it wasn't really adequate, but they made perfect use of it and got to this point where they really thought about expanding outside the footprint, adding those necessary program elements and making it fit for the future. And that's where we came in, and that's about 6 years ago. The interview was in 2019. We formed a large team. This was a large team of specialists, lots of specialists beyond acoustics and theater planners. There were, lighting. There was theatrical lighting. There was regular architectural lighting. There was, landscape, which is covered by our office. As you might probably know, Snøhetta is both. We're both landscape architects and architects, and we usually collaborate on every project. So our office worked beyond the building on the site planning as well. Yeah, this is how it started, and it's been a long process, about 6 years. We typically start working through a series of larger like master planning and visioning phases, then into concept before we go into basic services.
Before we get into building specific details, give me a broad description of the scope of this project.
So the scope of the project has 2 parts, basically 2 categories. One obviously is the modernization of Powell Hall, this 100-year-old movie palace, former movie palace, bringing that up to current standards, current codes, life safety, accessibility, and comfort. And then beyond that, the second component is the expansion that we designed, and basically all the program elements that did not really, were either missing or didn't fit into the existing building. Those happened in the expansion, and the expansion itself has kind of a a front of house portion, and as a back of house, a backstage. And then one other significant component that was kind of desired by the client was a multi-purpose and a rehearsal room. So until now, the symphony rehearsed inside the main hall. They didn't have a second venue, so that was another important component of the expansion.
They must be so thrilled now with everything that they have.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite a moment when we reopened a few weeks ago, and the musicians really came back and were able to use the new center holistically. It was very, very positively received,
I
yeah.
I can
Especially by
only
those who've been there for decades. Mm.
That's just it's so wildly different from, having to practice in a boiler room or get dressed in a restroom.
Yes,
So let's
and
start with the site itself. So my understanding from I read everything you sent me and then did a little research of my own online. So I understand that the project size itself is 189,130 square feet, which includes a 65,000 square foot expansion. And my experience is that these types of buildings, like I know where our symphony plays here in Portland, is right smack dab in the middle of the city. Um, did you have any particular, because you're expanding here, you're not just remodeling an existing building.
Mhm.
Did you have any particular issues to deal with the site to accommodate this expansion?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. In this case, the Powell Hall is located within a larger theater district, an arts district in St. Louis. It's called the Grand Center, and the Grand Center is sort of lined lined up around Grand Boulevard, hence the name. Um, there used to be even more theaters in the past. Currently, there's the fabulous Fox Theater is another large venue, also converted movie theater into a concert venue. And the area used to be much denser. So over the last decades, buildings have disappeared. Adjacent to our building, Powell Hall, um, the immediate buildings were torn down over time. So there were lots available right next to the building that were used as surface parking lots, really. And the symphony acquired those lots and combined them, and that's where we physically expanded the building. So we're located on a corner lot on Grant Avenue and Del Mar, and Del Mar to the north, Grant to the west. So the natural ways to expand were to the south of the building and to the east, right to the back of the fly tower. So that was naturally going to be the direction for the backstage expansion.
So sticking with the site still before we start working our way around the building and in the
Mhm.
building. Describe for me some of the unique exterior site design components that you included in this project.
Right. So I think one of the large moves urbanistically that we made was the decision to expand on the south side, but move the expansion or set it back from Grand Boulevard to create a plaza, an urban plaza that has many functions. Um, it could be a space for gathering before a show. It could even be used for small performances outdoors. So something that didn't exist previously. Previously you would enter um, the building right under a canopy from a very narrow sidewalk. So now there's actually room now to breathe and to gather before you enter the building. And that said, we moved the entrances. We moved the main entrance into the expansion, and we closed off the old entrance. That was kind of a difficult decision because, in the memory of many people that have been going to the symphony for a long time, um, that was always the entrance, and they would naturally go there. But I think with this large gesture that we made, creating this plaza and pulling it back, and it is very intuitive now to enter the building. So that's one big feature. Other features are a drop-off. There was no formal drop-off before. Now there's a drop-off that's integrated into the site plaza on the south side. We have reconfigured the parking. People still arrive mostly by cars at the symphony and other theaters in the area. And we have created some landscape features that deal with stormwater management and so on. So part of our sustainability ideas there.
So I like to just kind of work my way from the outside to the inside when we're talking about the building, and particularly since I now work for a building enclosure consultant, I'm extra interested in the exterior design of the building. So let's talk about that a little bit. What were some of the things you designed for the exterior facade of this building and some of the more unique materials that you used?
Right. Well, the material is actually not very unique. St. Louis is a masonry, it's a brick city. Most of the buildings in the Grand Center are built with brick. Powell Hall is a brick building. Some parts of the facade are terracotta, but the majority is brick. So it was fairly clear early on that we'll work with the same material. But in terms of scale and size and shape, form, we made some choices that made the building more complementary to the existing building. So it was important to us to kind of preserve that iconic look of the original building and create something that's a partner to it, but that doesn't mimic it. That's got its own identity. And there's people in my office that called the expansion a dance partner. It's something that really belongs together. They're dancing together. They're not stepping on their toes, but they have their discrete characters. So that's what we did. The expansion is relatively small when you look at it. It's sort of leaning against the original building. It's shorter in height. So from most views, the original silhouette is preserved. It's not overpowered with the expansion. One other thought that we had was the original building kind of felt very introverted or hermetic. It had this like big formal facade on grand. It's almost like a Roman Greco style facade with arched openings. But then it also had 3 blank facades in the back. And you really had to enter to see, this magnificent space on the interior. And for the expansion, we thought about complementing it and almost turning it into an inside-out approach where we took some of that playful language of the hall and brought it to the exterior. So the original building is, again, almost like a extruded rectangle, a box. And we created an expansion that had curves in the facade, that had a facade that was slightly leaning. So it had a very distinguished geometry. And at the same time, it had to be buildable out of brick. It had to be relatively simple construction. Obviously, everyone has a budget. We had a budget to meet here too. But we try to see if there's more innovative ways to work with brick. And one idea was to create the exterior almost out of curved shells that are, when you look at it in the abstract, they're parts of a leaning cylinder. So a cylinder that's kind of like tilted to its side. When you cut horizontal sections through it, so every brick coursing is actually the same radius as you march up the building. So that was something that we achieved, and we worked through with the mason. They were able to build it, without many questions asked. There was not a whole lot of RFIs. It worked surprisingly nice and came out very, very beautiful. There were some tricky moments. I think the arched openings that we created, those have what's called a concealed lintel system. So that had to be engineered, and that was one of the more challenging facade features. Custom corner pieces. We thought about doing these custom angled corners from the factory, But then after some tests, we saw that during the firing process, brick shrinks, these angles actually change, and it's less accurate. So we work again with the mason and used a cut brick that was then epoxy together, and it actually created a much cleaner geometry at these custom corners.
Interesting. So my first rabbit hole question, I thought I'd get a little bit further before I had a question that I was going to throw out there that's not on the list. But because you've now made it clear to me how old this building was, and the last major renovation was still a very long time ago. Obviously, energy efficiency is huge, and I know that sustainable buildings is a big thing for your firm. I've been familiar with your firm for a long time. What did you do with this? I mean, that's a really old building.
Mhm.
And so, I spent a short time, 6.5 years working for MEP consultants, writing specs. And I imagine that part of the mission here was to make it a more energy efficient, tighter building. Since you were, really going to be ripping into a lot of the building, what did you do to kind of help bring that up to something resembling this century in energy efficiency?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, maybe first off, by reusing an old building, adaptive reuse, that alone, and just giving this 100-year-old building a new life or extending its life, I think that alone is a huge sustainability or part of the sustainability strategy here. Obviously, the new addition is meeting the code, is beyond code. It's airtight and well insulated and all that. But we did replace all the mechanical systems. Obviously, those were outdated. With state of the art systems, we built a separate plant in a basement to the east of the building in the addition that is serving the old building and the new building. The air is a displacement air system, so it's delivered from below the concert hall floor, very at a very low velocity, so it's nice and quiet. So that reduces the energy consumption significantly. The old building is separated from the expansion, so there's a fire separation, which was one of the major challenges. On one hand, we wanted to connect the buildings and stitch them together as good as we can, but there is a 3-hour rated facade separation between the two. To overcome that, we had to use horizontal fire curtains and so on that are seamlessly retracted in walls, so you don't see it every day. But something that just made the building and the construction quite complicated. But yeah, back to your questions about energy efficiency. The systems, the upgrades to the mechanical systems. That's one big part of it. The old building, the hall had not the latest generation of lighting, theatrical lighting and house lighting. So everything is obviously low energy LED system now. Also generating less heat overall, so there's less of a load to deal with. What else did we do?
What about like air leakage? I worked in an old
Hmm.
1800s brick building for the first 22 years of my career. And so just in the building tightness in the enclosure in the old building, was
Yeah.
there much that you could do to tighten that up?
Well, the building is, it's on the register, so we couldn't change do too much to the envelope. We did replace all the windows on the east facade facing Grand. Those are windows and doors, emergency egress doors. Those are all brand new wood doors. I think I can't say the manufacturer probably here, but they're much more tight. There's new seals in there. We had an acoustic problem, so the building previously had egress straight out to the north and the south. There were cast iron steel stairs there, without a sound and light lock. So in case of a fire, people would just like open up the door and leave the building straight out to exterior stairs, egress stairs. So that was a source of noise, um, but also of air leakage. So those doors are replaced. There's new gaskets in there that made a big difference. The roof has some updates in the flight tower, which is actually occupied by some of the offices. The administration is located within the flight tower. That was part of the 1968 transformation. That has been replaced. Windows have been updated there. So overall, subtle updates to the building, but with a significant effect on energy and noise. What we've heard is previously, an ambulance would go by, or somebody would just a speeding car would go by, and you could hear it inside the hall, which is absolutely something you
Yeah,
don't
not
want
not
in a
what you want happening
symphony.
in this symphony hall.
No, no.
So there is a lot going on inside this building, a lot. And I was struggling a little bit on where to start, so I thought let's start with the entry and work our way around. So tell me about some of the more unique design elements inside this building. So if I walk into that new entry, what's the first thing I see?
So first of all, well, there's the one new main entrance, but that's not the only entrance. We deliberately um, designed entrances on every facade. We wanted to open up the building on all sides and activate the facade. So I mentioned earlier the building had one formal facade, and it had three almost blank facades previously. Now two of those facades are activated with the expansion. We also um, convinced the symphony to introduce a new entrance on the north side, a small entrance that kind of opens up and looks out to the community to the north of us. Um, Del Mar, which is the street on the north of the building, is a large socioeconomic divide within the city. And we really wanted to create a gesture, an invitation to that side of the community too. And that plus a lay-by, a drop-off, kind of activated that facade. There's now views through the building in that direction. But coming back to the expansion, so the expansion has two new entrances, one from the plaza and one from the opposite side facing the parking. And that will be a direction that many people will take to get into this new lobby. The new lobby is a large triple height space. Um, it has two stacked or terraced lobby floors that correspond to balcony levels inside the hall. With the expansion on the south side, obviously we changed how you enter the building and how you get to your seat finally. Everything used to be just happening from the Grand Boulevard side. Now we also adding a new way to get into the building from the south side. So, but back to your question, as you step in, probably the first thing that you notice is a sculptural stair. It's almost a sculpture that connects the open terraces. One of the things that's important in this type of building, and that the old building already had in its lobby, is the aspect of see and be seen. Like you're going to a concert hall not just to enjoy music, but it's a social space. It's a space where people arrive early and they want to meet their friends and they want to see and be seen. So expanding that on the south side and giving more opportunities for that aspect was part of the design as well.
Our symphony hall slash Broadway theater, all of that good stuff, has like, for instance, in the lobby area, there's a couple of bars. There are the social aspect is
Hmm.
expanded more by people being able to, get cocktails or snacks and hang out there. Unfortunately, in our hall, it's not large enough to accommodate the numbers of people coming in, so it's really cramped down there. Did you have some of those kinds of things in your space as well?
Yeah, I mean, like it's good that you bring that up, and it's maybe I should start with Powell Hall again, the historic building, which used to be a movie theater, and it has a great lobby and an amazing space that and we read it was modeled after the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. So it's this like grand, almost Baroque space with a big stair and chandeliers, multiple balconies, but it was very tight. Like the square footage was small. It never had enough space to accommodate all of the 2,600 patrons. So what we heard is there was always this kind of joke. During intermission, you could either get a drink if you're patient enough and wait in line, or you could use the restrooms, but you could never do both things at once. The 15 minutes were not enough to do that. And that was kind of the starting point for us to think about, the amenities and where to place these amenities in the new lobby. And the principle is very simple. We try to locate the bars that you mentioned, the concessions, as close and central as possible so that people can reach them from every seat without changing levels, that every balcony level would have a corresponding lobby and a concession and restrooms and other amenities right there. And that was kind of driving the organization of those front of house spaces.
Could you come to Portland and fix ours, please? Because that's so funny that you just told that story, because that is exactly what we all say when we go to ours. You can either
Yeah.
use the restroom and maybe if you're lucky, make it through or maybe if you're lucky, make it through the line to get a drink. Definitely couldn't do both, and you were lucky if you made it through the line to get a drink. I was just there a
So,
couple weeks ago,
hmm.
Broadway show with my granddaughter, and I'm like, "Which one's more important to you? Do you need to go to the restroom, or do you wanna go get a soda, because we're not getting both?" Um,
It seems to be a common issue with concert halls or this type of venue. You can never have enough of either. But previously there were two concessions. One of them was a mobile concession, and we added three major concession bars in the new building. And furthermore, there's a donor lounge, a separate lounge that has its own concession bar as well. Yeah.
so what about the, sticking with interior spaces for a few minutes, what about the auditorium itself? What kinds of unique things did you do? I've worked on public schools for years, and auditoriums were a part of that. So I have experience working with theater consultants and special drapes and all of these different things you have to think about that you don't have to on a normal project. What kinds of things did you do in that auditorium to make it this amazing, even better acoustic space?
Yeah, I mean, it was an amazing space 6 years ago when we saw it. It's still amazing, and there's a lot of love for it, and people are very attached to the space, the materials, the finishes, um, everything beyond the acoustics. The acoustics are already very, very nice, and there was a fear that any intervention would take away from that. So we had to be very, very careful and do it in a very discreet way. So, for example, we had 2,600 seats in there, but those seats were designed in 1960, 68, so they were quite tight for today's comfort. And sidelines were not optimal. The aisles were narrow. So we decided together with the theater planners and the symphony to remove seats and to lower the count by around 400. So now the seats are wider. They're still in a very similar. They look very similar. They're still red velvet, slightly different red. But they're all new seats. They're comfortable. To a point where the client even asked for cup holders. You can have your opinion about it, but it's something that they wanted, and that's integrated. But the big change and the really challenging part of the modernization of that hall is to to integrate or to make it accessible, really. And that was not a thought in 1925 for sure, and then even in 1968 it was not a main main concern. So we had to be very careful with regrading parts of the orchestra floor. So we did some micrograding in there to achieve the ramps, to achieve accessible ramps, to eliminate steps that were there. We had to introduce new cross aisles and everything, so without disturbing the character of the hall. So when you squint your eyes, you notice it's slightly different, but it still feels the same as before and all along.
So that's a perfect lead in because my next question was about accessibility because you really make a point of mentioning that in your project description. So outside of what you did with the floors in the main auditorium itself, what else did you do? That old of a building, I imagine it did not have great accessibility. What else did you do inside the building to make it more accessible?
Yeah, what I just described is more is part of the kind of accessibility ADA standards that we had to apply and achieve, um, as part of the modernization. But there's also the other aspect of accessibility to the building in general and to this typology of the symphony. And the symphony has worked a long time on this, and they've had great ideas about expanding the audience and attracting new audience to a symphony by offering different types of music, changing their program. So they've done a whole lot of that kind of accessibility. But what we hope to deliver was making a building that is more welcoming and inviting and kind of removes that barrier of entering a building. Previously you really had to buy a ticket and then walk through a very tight box office until you got into the lobby and then the hall. So many people wouldn't even, and we like to not only talk to our clients, we meet a lot of people during the process. We sometimes even talk to an Uber driver that takes us from the airport to the project and ask them for their experience and have they ever been to the symphony. And many people say, well, I know that the symphony is there, but I've never really been there, or there's something that didn't make it accessible for everyone. And we try to change that with the architecture, with a building that is more extroverted, more inviting, more open, has a grand entrance, that you walk in even without a ticket. So the ticket um, box office is actually kind of inside the main lobby. The main lobby is open at all times during the day. So it kind of sparks an interest. People are naturally exploring, walking into the building, even seeing the grand stair, and then deciding, oh, I want to see a show here. So it's that kind of accessibility too that we try to address with architecture, with some of the design decisions that we made.
I love that because I don't think I've ever heard anybody address accessibility that way before, but I have to say that's genius. You do. I mean, historically, back in the day, it's going to a symphony was typically reserved for people who were rather wealthy. Um, and over time, there's a lot of tickets for anything are expensive anymore. But, you know, to make it a place where somebody can go in and kind of check it out even before they're attending something and maybe be a little less intimidated by that.
Yes,
Um,
and that is really the mission of the symphony. Even before we came on board, this is something that they were very interested in achieving. Like music for all, welcoming all, being very inclusive to all communities. And they achieved a lot just by making these connections. But then this was their chance with the physical transformation of the center to do it as well. So
so tell me about some of the more unique things you did with interior finishes and some of the materials you used on the inside of the building too. Obviously you have an old building, so you've already alluded to like the velvet and the the seats is a little bit different color, red. Obviously, in the old building, there
Right.
was probably more that you had to stay within historic preservation requirements. The new building, you could do much more that you wanted. So tell me about some of the more unique things.
Yeah, the existing building, is extremely opulent, rich. As you mentioned, it has velvet and dark wood and a lot of gold and beige colored walls. So it's got its own palette, a very rich palette. We obviously took cues from that. We were inspired by it, but we we tried to reduce our palette so that it's very clear where you are. You are either in the expansion, you're going back into the other world. It's between two worlds basically. Um, and we limited ourselves to a handful of materials really on the interiors in the expansion. So there's a lot of plaster. There's terrazzo throughout for the floors. It's a very durable, elegant material, and we use wood, natural wood, but not as dark as in the existing building. We used white oak veneers along the concessions. We had some walls behind the concession ceilings, and but we didn't use it. We used it very carefully, and we used it as a wayfinding tool too. So from a distance, as you look into the lobby from the outside, you kind of spot these moments that are rendered in wood, and understand those are amenities. Those are special places to go to, special um, public program. And it's also something that you want to walk up to and touch and feel. So that's why we use wood there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. There's one more material, an important material. Everywhere where we had a threshold between the existing building and the new building, the connections, those are typically framed in a metal, in a champagne colored, kind of a lighter version of the historic gold. So it's a champagne color. And we use that also for the soffits over the arched windows, the arched openings into the expansion. So those are also champagne colored metal.
So, from a design perspective, what would you say was the most difficult challenge to work out in the design of this building, and how did you navigate that?
That's a tricky question because just working on a building that is 100 years old, and especially one that's this complex um, by itself is extremely challenging. Um, it's hard to pinpoint one challenge, but I think the biggest challenge, just stepping back from a design perspective, is finding this appropriate approach to scale and kind of form and language um, to complement a building with that stature. So I think that's something that we worked very hard on, and we had many different um, studies until it kind of uh, became a series of these curved shells that are creating the expansion. It was pretty clear from the beginning that this has to be a masonry building. We're going to have the same DNA as the existing building, but we're going to use the brick in a different way, in a complementary way. So that was probably a big challenge. And then there was small challenges all along, all the unexpected. When you open up or touch an old building and you find something that's not necessarily documented in any drawings, and then you adapt to it. And
I've heard stories. There's an old church in New York that I did an interview on. That I'm drawing a blank on the name of the church at the moment, but they opened the walls and found artifacts
Mhm.
that somebody had at some point put inside the walls of this church. There's just all kinds of crazy things. They get dug into the ground and found things that they had no idea were there. So you always have to account for that.
Yeah, we
And
have we have two. I have two stories, like a little bit similar to that, but not artifacts. But when they started excavating for the new building, for the expansion, there was a moment when they found bones, large bones in the ground, and everyone had to stop, obviously.
Right.
We didn't know what it was. The police, St. Louis police, was investigating, and turns out it was the remains, almost as old as the original building, 100 years old, of dogs. There was remains of several dogs, apparently.
That, I mean,
That was a creepy moment where everyone had to stop work for 2
well, and,
days
and
until.
from I mean, it's creepy no matter what, but from a project perspective, depending on what those bones are, I actually teach a class and I talk, about some of the things that could happen that could mess up a project. And if those turn out to be, like, say, ancient tribal burial site or
Absolutely.
any kind of historic thing, it
Mhm.
can delay your project for
Oh,
years.
of
So
course. Or
that's an instant heart attack if it's a
yes.
bone.
Yeah.
You'd much rather find, like, groundwater or something like that over
Right.
or over bones because it could stop a project, sometimes
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Um,
that's what exactly happened and what everybody thought about. That was a possibility, but, I think we're kind of relieved to hear it was dogs, as much as we all like
so y
dogs.
you said 2 stories. What's the
And then
other
the other
one?
story, yes, also a shock that happened was, again, an old building, 100 years old, and that building, has a life of its own, and it changes, and, you have good surveys, and we have done 3D surveys on the interior, we have surveyed the exterior, but we haven't surveyed all of the facades all the way up. So we found out when they were setting up the expansion coordinates on the side, they found out that the building actually twisted over time. The entire building twisted, and one of the facades was leaning out, and we had an issue with the lot line, and we had to this was during construction, early construction, we had to go back into our model, everyone, all consultants, structure, everyone, and start shifting the building on one end 5 inches. 5 inches doesn't sound a whole lot, but it
5 inches is a lot,
is a lot. Yes, it is a lot, and that was a shock, and we thought this is going to be a big problem, but we all worked through it, and
especially to figure
no
that
one
out
else.
during
Yeah.
construction. That's a lot.
Yes, very
Well,
late, very, very late. Mhm.
kudos to your team for that one. I think I'd rather find the bones. Uh, so speaking of construction, you know, you've already told me a couple of little stories, but the construction phase of a project always comes with its own challenges and surprises. There's no such thing as a perfect project. Uh, Old buildings seriously have their own whole set of stories that are drastically different than a new building from the ground up. Tell me a little bit more about the construction phase and maybe some of the things you found challenging during construction, because you're also trying to marry old and new
Mhm.
and still have it feel like one, maybe two worlds, but within one universe.
Right. Um, I would say one of the biggest challenges was schedule. Like the construction phase took only two. I say only because given the complexity that we're dealing with, 2.5 years is not a long time. So it's faster than what we see in other projects, really, and that had to do with the symphony's seasons. So we really had to plan around the seasons all along throughout the design phase too, but especially during construction because that was the time when the symphony moved out of their venue and they were in temporary spaces. And just financially, they couldn't afford to not be operational, um, within this time. And they reopened now for this fall season. So there was absolutely no option to extend the schedule, and everybody had to do whatever they could to stay on schedule. So that was a challenge for not only the contractors and the construction team, but all of us.
Well, especially with the work in the existing building, because you're going to have things that come up in a building that old that are going to delay things that you have to work.
Absolutely.
Like you have to get a building lined back up 5 inches.
Yes.
And when you don't have that cushion, how did staging look for this project? I know you said, they had place to build the
Hmm.
building with the empty lots. Were there issues with staging?
Not at all. There was, what now is the surface parking lot to the east of the building. That was pretty much the staging area. There's plenty of space for all the trailers and delivery and so on. So that was all fairly straightforward. You know?
I love asking this question. I ask pretty much every guest these days this question.
Mhm. It
What
is it is a challenge here in New York City when we
Well,
do
no,
work here. It's
I've heard some of the most interesting stories. And this wasn't even a podcast interview. This was some other like session I went to, but learning session. But they had it was in some big building in New York where they had to get big MEP equipment into different places in this building and big cranes and everything. And they actually staged that whole highly scheduled it in advance. And things had to like match up to the second in what they were doing. And they did it. This was a crazy thing. They did it in real time using Twitter
Mm.
to communicate as they were moving these ginormous units up the building, and they used it because they needed something that there would be no delay, that it would be an immediate
Is it
communication.
wow.
And I just thought that was a number of years ago I heard about that one, but I thought, "Who comes up with this crazy stuff?" Never would have occurred to me. So, I know every project I do teaches me a lesson. What would you say was your biggest lesson learned from this particular project that made you a better architect on the next one?
I w I would say, and maybe this is true for many projects, but for this one especially, it was such a large group of stakeholders, of experts that I work with, both on the client side and our design team side. We really learned how to listen, how to ask the right questions, and you know not come with preconceived solutions. Is really sitting down with the musicians, with people that operate a symphony for decades, and finding the solutions together. I think that was something that we did early on, and it was really 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 helpful. And we'll do this on every project to some extent, but I think we really um, did the right thing here. And it was tough because we started this project during the pandemic too, so a lot of these meetings didn't happen in person. It was like kind of like when everyone got used to the Zoom communication. It was interesting. It was an interesting start of a project, but I think we all learned a lot about communication, about working with a large, diverse client group, um, building consensus, but also having them being part of a design process. Kind of like we like to have these like very early exercises where we sit together with stakeholders and um, have them sometimes come up with an idea. And anyone that is part of this team, can have the best idea. It doesn't necessarily need to be one of us on the architecture side. So we try to engage everyone, and the outcome was that there was a lot of kind of robust, um, you know, um, feedback and buy-in into ideas that helped us all the way, even through construction, when decisions had to be made, or things had to be substituted, or God forbid there's a VE moment where things had to be cost had to be reduced, but at least there were stakeholders that were already advocating for an idea and they wanted something, and early on it helped everyone.
Well, and I would imagine working with a client like this symphony, and this is not a slam to anybody, but you have clients like pick any major corporation that has locations all over the country. You have a whole design and construction department typically, and so you have a client group that is very savvy about design and construction. And then you have clients like maybe the symphony or maybe some little school district where they have a board
Mhm.
of people that make all the decisions, but these people have never worked on a construction project before, never been involved in a design process. And again, no slam to anybody, but it's a whole different level of communication
Correct.
because
And
you're
education too.
educating. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, as much as we listen and learn from the symphony, and it wasn't only the board members, but the symphony was open enough to bring in, you know, representatives from the musician side, from other involved um, trades. So it was a mix, a very mixed group of specialists, and we learned as much from them as they learned from us about the process. Yes, and you're right. Many of them have never um, done a construction project at all, or of that magnitude. Yes.
Right.
So
And I've done that. I've been involved in projects like that throughout my career, and I almost feel like sometimes you end up with a better result, because you don't have these people that are already,
hmm
knowledgeable about design and construction. That, oh, this is how we always do it. So they maybe come up with some crazy ideas that you may or may not be able to accommodate. But I feel like in situations like that where everybody isn't particularly savvy about design and construction, they can come at it more authentically about how a space makes them feel, or how sounds affect what they do, those kinds of things. And I don't know, I feel like sometimes you end up with a better, more authentic building.
of course, and I think that makes the building very, very, more interesting. And I give you an example. Like there's about 100 musicians at the symphony, and they come together. They have it's called a musicians lounge. They use that space every day. That's where they have the coffees, and they celebrate birthdays and so on. It used to be one of their basement spaces previously. Obviously, that's not what anyone wanted. So they have now one of the nicest spaces that is actually facing east, has lots of natural daylight, and it looks out towards downtown St. Louis. And even in the background, you see the arch, the world famous arch. That's their space. And, we asked the question, like, where do you want to be? Like early on. And they kind of point like, oh, we'd like to be here in this corner. And we want to have this. And we want to, they all have their individual cups. They have 100 coffee cups with, people with their names on it, with a slogan or something, but it's very individual. And in their old room, they had a corner where they were kind of like displaying it haphazard. So we thought that'll be a nice design feature. We're going to design you um, a little shelf for your cups, for your 100 cups, and you can display them. So that became a feature in that room.
When you think about where they work, it's typically, inside the auditoriums. There's never
hmm
windows. It's the
hmm
darker spaces. They practice for hours and hours and hours on end. To have a space with some light and some
Yeah.
views and something that they can call their own, that they don't feel like, oh, just like I don't have to go change my clothes in the bathroom. They feel like they're important in the work they've done a lifetime to achieve. Because I've had friends in the past that were actually part musicians in a symphony. Um, feel like they are as important and valued as the work they've done their entire lives to do what they do for a living.
Great.
I'm sure makes a big difference. I would have loved to have seen all their faces the first day they walked in. There's just, wow.
Absolutely. Yeah,
So
maybe just to kind of highlight, like the front of house, the spaces that we created, the lobby, the concessions and all that for the audience, all of that is important, but it all doesn't really work if there's not a really, really well functioning backstage area, back of house area. And so we spent a lot of attention on that, and we worked again with all the specialists, the theater planners, but also the musicians themselves to organize that space as rational as we can. And you brought up daylight. Daylighting was one of the strategies to introduce as much daylight as possible. So all the practice rooms, the major practice rooms, have windows out towards Del Mar. Urbanistically, it also puts eyes on the street. There's a safety aspect of it, and you see that the building is activated. The facade is activated, windows, lights are on. That was all very, very important when we planned the back of house.
well, what's happening back of house is what makes what we all see when we go to whatever the performance is
Yeah.
magic. If it doesn't work back there, then the show is not going to be as good. The unsung heroes are back there
That's right.
making it all work. So before we get to our 2 closing questions that I ask on every episode, tell me about what this is your chance to celebrate Snøhetta. What is Snøhetta working on now that I can look forward to calling you back and saying, "So come tell me about this one."
Well, we have a number of interesting projects, either on the boards or in construction. You probably have to speak with one of my colleagues who's leading one of those projects. But I think really exciting is a presidential library that we're working on. It's the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in Medora, North Dakota,
Well,
and it's scheduled to be opening next summer, coinciding with the 250-year anniversary of the country. So no pressure again to be opening right on time. It's a very interesting building. It's more than a building. It's almost a blend between landscape and architecture. There's moments when you it's called the Badlands. I've not been there personally, but it's a beautiful area of the country that inspired Roosevelt, uh, and set his conservation mindset. Basically, he's the one that started the national park system,
right.
so that's all reflected in the design. There's a high emphasis on sustainability. The project is a mass timber building. It's uh, integrated into the landscape. So yeah, there's moments you don't see it. You can walk on the roof. It's completely landscaped over. So that building is interesting to look out for. We call it a living library. So it's constantly it's changing over time. It's not a traditional museum. And then another one that I'm working on is here in New York for the city of New York for the Parks Department. Um, we're doing a rec center in the Bronx for a community that really anticipates this building. They really need a rec center and an after school facility. So it's a really interesting building, located inside of a park. And we learned that we don't have any zoning restrictions in the park. So building in a park is a whole new experience. When you think about New York and you work within very tight lots and you're within the street grid, but here we have a building that's sort of sitting freely inside of a park for a community that really needs it. So that's an exciting project, different from some of our other projects, but it's highly anticipated. Yeah.
I wonder how many people are gonna listen to this episode in the New York area and, "Let's go look at the parks. What can we do in a park?"
Yeah, this is called the Soundview Recreation Center. It's in Soundview Park in the Bronx. Uh,
Oh, good, I'll add those to my list
yeah,
to
and we're
poke somebody at your firm
finishing we're
later.
finishing construction documents for that, and things take a little bit with the city, so we're hoping for construction to start at some point next year.
So I always close out every episode with 2 closing questions. The first being a broader industry question, just to get your take or your opinion on whatever topic I pull out of my hat. So one of the bigger issues in our industry for architects is managing, and I thought this project was a perfect example for this question, is managing client expectations in order to meet project budgets and schedules and what you can and can't do in a building and all of those things. What are your best practices to help clients stay on the same page and have reasonable expectations for the amount of money and time that they have available?
Yeah, no, this is managing client expectations is probably one of the most critical and difficult aspects of our work. Um, I I touched on this a little bit before. We like to start projects like this with a um, visioning phase or a master planning phase. It's less about a design. It's more about developing a vision or a strategy, and really kind of educating the client, but also learning from the client during that time to arrive, at a project and to understand exactly what the expectations are on their side, and also involving outside consultants early on, such as we don't call them cost consultants necessarily. It's more like a cost modeler at that point, where you can kind of benchmark um, budgets and construction budgets, and kind of work with the client together to see, how much, what kind of program, how much program is appropriate, and for this type of project early on, that there's no surprises later. And what we like to avoid, obviously, is where the expectations are not aligned between us, all of us, and we need to then later, in later phases, value engineer or remove program or something like that. That's always a bad start in our opinion. So to avoid that, we like to, all get on the same page early on. Um, we we like to work with these cost consultants who know us well. They know when we do a rough sketch, they know, this is XYZ cost, and they can help educate the client too. I'll give you an example. Here's an interesting thing. We did this on this project. Everyone was on board. The budget was the budget, and at some point, and this may have to do with the pandemic, the costs were kind of like spiraling, and there was, as everyone knows, supply chain issues and things, and inflation, and things became more expensive. And someone asked the question, now, is there a way to simplify the building? Is the architecture or the geometry, the shape of the building, making the costs go up and making this building expensive? And we always try to tell people, the biggest contributor to cost is program. It's the size of the building. It's not exactly how it looks and whether it's curved or not. But they didn't believe us. So we went and created a very simplified scheme. We called it the strawman scheme. So we created a very boxy scheme where every wall was just straight, planar, and everything was rectangular. And then we had it priced by the general contractor. So we were working with a GC um, early on, even during design phases, and they were providing cost input. It turns out the simplified scheme was only 5% cheaper than what we proposed. So the client went back, said like, well, no, we don't want this.
We
We
want the pretty building
we
for
want
5%.
we
Yeah.
want the building that we've seen all along, that our donors and others in the community wants.
So you just triggered another question. Even though we're in the final questions, I'm going to throw one more in here. Um, it's a two-part question, actually. Is the symphony a public client or a private client?
It's actually a nonprofit organization.
And so,
It,
what was your project delivery method? I'm assuming with that tight schedule, you were not going to risk going with design, bid, build.
no, we decided together with the client to bring on a general contractor, GC, early during design phase already, and they established a GMP at some point towards the end of the
So
design.
more of a construction management
Yes,
kind of
and
model.
right, and then they stayed on. It was openly bid, but they stayed on. They were very familiar with the project, especially with the existing building, and they had already time in advance before construction to explore that building. So it was a good configuration.
I would think you wouldn't have any choice with the schedule that you had to meet and them needing to be open. I'm sure that was a lot of intricate things to plan, and
Yeah, and they were
you
at
need
early
that input.
packages,
Yeah,
right? And
early
the
in
facade,
design.
package was bid out earlier,
Yeah.
before we finished the full design package. Yeah.
So final question. I very sarcastically joke that this is the easiest question of the day, and I ask every guest. So we all hope, I hope we all hope, and I know I hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. So for you as a human being, personal or professional, what do you hope your impact will be?
I hope my impact is not measured necessarily, by the projects that I help create with others, many others. Today I'm only speaking, but I'm just one of many that worked on this project. But I think it's about how a project like this or any other project that we create impacts people's lives and their experience of the world. I think that's more important than the object, the architecture, the building itself. I think like what really how it contributes to the environment and the community where it is.
Takashi, thank you so much for joining me today. This is a super cool project. I hope I don't have any immediate plans in the future to be in St. Louis. I have been there before though, so I never know where my journeys will take me, but I will definitely check it out when I'm there. I appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to talk to me today, and I hope you'll consider coming back and sharing other. I've had a very um, very fond feelings towards Snøhetta for a long time since they came to
Thank
Portland and spoke to us and some of the work you've done here.
Yeah.
I hope you'll come back and tell me about more
Yeah, we love to
projects.
come back. Yeah.
The door's always open. You don't wait for me to call you either. If you've got something good, hey Cherise, we've got something. You want to talk?
Okay. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you very much.